The bell tower at Elmswood was not meant to hold a man's weight against the outer rail, and yet there he was. One boot slipped past the stone lip, his gloved hand closing on nothing but the cold October air. Alice Marrow had come up the narrow stair only to open the shutter, because the seamstress's room below caught no morning light until the tower let it down through the old glass, and she had climbed with a pincushion still strapped to her wrist and a length of gray thread caught in her hair. She did not think, her body moved before. Her mind gave it leave. She caught the back of his coat in both fists, braced her heel against the base of the rail, and pulled with everything the years of work had put into her arms. For one long breath they hung together over the drop, the fields far below them gone gold with the turning season. And then he came back over the rail, and they fell to the stone floor in a tangle of wool and linen, her cheek against his shoulder, his heart hammering so hard she could feel it through the fabric. He did not thank her. He did not speak at all. He only looked at her, and she found she could not name the thing that was in his face. Only that it was not gratitude, and it was not shame, and it held her there on the cold stone longer than propriety would ever have allowed. Stay with me through this one. Some stories ask you to wait for the turn, and this is one of them, so keep the sound on and let it unfold. To understand what she had caught, you must understand what she was, and what he was, and how far the distance stretched between them. Alice was 24 years old, and she had been 3 years in service at Elmswood, sewing for a household that did not know her name. Her father had been a clockmaker in the town of Netherford, a careful man with careful hands, and when the fever took him in the spring of her 20th year, it took the shop as well, the debts calling in faster than the mourning bands could be sewn. She had gone into service because there was nothing else, and she had learned to make herself small in the way that servants learn, to move through a great house like a draft, under a door, present and unremarked. She was good with a needle. That much the housekeeper allowed her. Her seams were straight and her hems invisible, and when the fine ladies came to visit, and a flounce tore on the stair, it was Alice who was sent for. Alice who knelt in the corridor with pins in her mouth and mended the damage before the orchestra had finished its second set. She did the work and returned to the low room below the tower, and asked for nothing. That was the shape her life had taken. She had stopped expecting it to take another. The seamstress's room sat low against the north foundation, one window at the height of the grass, and in winter the cold came up through the flags and into the soles of her feet, and stayed there from Michaelmas to Lady Day. She kept her thread in a wooden box her father had made, dovetailed at the corners the way he had taught her to look for, and she measured her days in finished hems, a morning gown taken in, a mourning band edged in black. A child's pinafore let out at the shoulder. She had learned that a life could be made small enough to fit inside such tasks, that if she did not look up from the work, the years passed without asking anything of her she could not give. She rose before the bell. She worked until the light failed, and then a while longer by tallow, because tallow was what the seamstresses were allowed. She had not wept for her father in 2 years, not because the grief had gone, but because she had folded it as neatly as a seam and put it away where it would not fray the day. The man she had caught was Nathaniel Ashford, the Earl of Renwick, and he was master of Elmswood and everything the eye could reach from its roof. He was 32, dark-haired, with a jaw that the household called cold, and a silence that the household called pride. He had come into the title 18 months before, and no one at Elmswood had seen him smile in all that time. He rode out alone at dawn. He dined alone when guests were not forced upon him. He climbed the bell tower more often than any man with business elsewhere should, and the servants had learned not to speak of it, because there are some griefs a great house carries without naming. He was not a cruel master. The household would grant him that much in the same breath they called him cold. He paid fare, and on the quarter day, he did not raise his hand or his voice. He simply moved through Elmswood like a man walking a house that was no longer quite his own, opening doors onto rooms he did not enter, and the servants came to understand that the coldness was not for them, but for something they could not see. He had been abroad when he came into the title, called home by a letter that reached him 3 weeks too late for the funeral. He had ridden through 2 nights to arrive at a grave already turfed over, and a house already draped. And he had stood at the foot of the great stair in his traveling coat, and understood that everything he was now was built on a thing he would have given all of it to undo. A man cannot say that at breakfast. So he said nothing, and rode out alone at dawn and climbed a tower. He had no business climbing, and let the house make of it what its fear required. What Alice did not yet know, kneeling on that tower floor with his heartbeat under her hand, was that the rail he had leaned against was the same rail his younger brother had gone over 2 winters past. James Ashford had been 21, laughing and reckless and beloved, and he had climbed the tower on a wager one frozen night and misjudged the ice on the stone. And Nathaniel had come into the title through the worst door a man can enter it. He did not climb the tower to follow his brother. He climbed it to stand where James had stood, and to hate the rail for holding him when it had not held the other. A household, though, sees a man at a height, and draws the conclusion nearest its fear. And so the servants watched. And so Alice had run up the stair when she saw a figure where no figure should be. He rose first from the floor. He offered her his hand, which was not a thing earls did for seamstresses, and she took it, because to refuse would have been its own kind of insolence, and he drew her to her feet with a care that did not match the coldness of his face. "You are hurt," he said. It was not a question. There was blood at her knuckles where they had struck the rail. "It is nothing, my lord," she said, and drew her hand back and folded it into her apron where he could not see it. "I only came to open the shutter." He looked at the shutter. He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes that she could not read. "What is your name, Alice?" "My lord, Iso." "Alice Marrow," he said, as though he were setting the name down somewhere to keep. Then he turned and went down the stair without another word, and she stood in the cold light with her heart going too fast, and she told herself it was only the fright of the fall. She was very good at telling herself things. She had needed to be. Below stairs, the story ran ahead of her before she reached the bottom of the tower. By the time she came into the seamstress's room, the under-housemaid Betsy had already heard a version in which Alice had thrown herself at the master and been rebuffed, and the cook had heard a version in which the master had been driven up the tower by melancholy, and Alice had merely been in the way. The truth, which was that she had saved his life, was too plain and too strange to survive the telling. "You want to mind yourself," Betsy said, not unkindly threading her own needle by the low window. "A girl who catches a lord's eye by catching a lord's coat, that is a story with only one ending, and it is not a wedding." She said it as though it were settled fact, the world as she had always found it. Alice bent to her work, and said nothing because there was nothing to say that Betsy would believe. The house was not empty that season, which made everything harder. The Dowager Countess of Renwick, Nathaniel's aunt by marriage, had come to Elmswood in the autumn, with a purpose she did not trouble to hide. Lady Ormsby was a woman of perhaps 60 years, upright as a fire-iron, and she had decided that the Earl had mourned long enough, and that the line required an heir, and that the heir required a countess, and she had brought the countess with her. Miss Cordelia Vane was 21, the daughter of a viscount with pale gold hair and a fortune of £30,000, and a manner so perfectly schooled that it never once slipped in company. She was, by every measure the world used, the correct choice. Lady Ormsby had measured her against every one of them, and found no fault. Alice saw them at their fittings because it was Alice who was sent up to take in Miss Vane's gowns and let out the dowagers, kneeling with her pins while the 2 women spoke over her head as though she were a piece of furniture. "The tower must be closed," Lady Ormsby said one afternoon, standing on a low stool while Alice pinned her hem. "It is morbid. His climbing up there, I will not have Cordelia think she is marrying a man who broods on rooftops. See that it is barred." She did not lower her voice for the seamstress at her feet. There was no reason to. "And that girl," she added, glancing down as though noticing Alice for the first time. "The one who made such a scene on the tower. She is not to attend Miss Vane again. I will not have a servant who imagines herself a heroine. Send up someone plainer." "A servant who imagines herself a heroine." Alice kept her eyes on the pins and did not let her hands shake, and she thought of the boot slipping past the stone, and she said nothing at all. Nathaniel, however, did not close the tower, and Nathaniel did not send another seamstress, and when the next fitting came, it was Alice who was summoned, and no one could say by whose order. She found him in the long gallery on the morning she was to go up, standing before the window with the autumn light falling gray across his face, and he did not turn when she entered, only spoke to the glass. "You did not tell anyone what you saw. It was not a question." Again he seemed to make his certainties into statements, and set them down like stones. "There was nothing to tell, my lord," she said. "You leaned too far. I caught your coat." "That is the whole of it." "That is not the whole of it," he said. And now he did turn, and the coldness the household spoke of was there in his face. But under it was something raw and unhealed that the household had never been permitted to see. "But I am grateful you tell it that way." He crossed the gallery and stopped an arm's length from her, closer than his rank required, and she felt the pull of him in her chest, like a thread drawn taut, and she hated her own body for it. "My brother went over that rail," he said low, the words costing him. "2 winters ago, the house believes I climb up to follow him. I climb to stand where he stood. There is a difference, and you are the only person at Elmswood I have said it to." He looked at her as though her silence were a rare and valuable thing. "Do not make me regret it." "I would not, my lord," she said, and meant it, and the meaning of it frightened her more than the fall had. "Bah!" She saw then how the coldness had been built, plank by plank, over a hurt that had no bottom, and she understood that he had shown her the one board that would lift. It was a dangerous knowledge for a seamstress to carry. A woman below stairs who holds a piece of the master's heart holds a thing she can be blamed for holding. She resolved to guard it the way she guarded her father's thimble out of sight, spoken up to no one, hers alone and safer for being secret. She did not yet let herself ask why he had given it to her, of all the people at Elmswood, or what it meant that he had chosen her silence to trust when he trusted nothing else. He named the wound once, and did not name it again, and that was how she came to hold a piece of him no one else at Elmswood held. She thought about James Ashford. After that, the brother she had never met, and she understood the Earl's silences differently, the way one understands a locked door differently, once one has been told what is behind it. She was not foolish enough to think it changed the distance between them. A seamstress who knew an earl's grief was still a seamstress. Even so, she found she watched for him in the corridors now, and she was ashamed of it, and she did it anyway. The witnessing came a fortnight later, and he saw it, though she did not know he was there. One of the kitchen boys, a child of perhaps 9, named Tom, had broken a serving dish and been threatened by the under-butler with dismissal, which for a boy with no family meant the road and the workhouse and worse. Alice found him weeping in the passage behind the still-room, and she did what she had learned to do, which was to make a thing right quietly and take no credit for it. She had a little money saved, coin by coin, against a future she did not let herself imagine. She gave the boy enough to replace the dish twice over, and told the under-butler she had found it broken already, and had paid for its like from the town, and she asked him to let the matter drop. She did it because the boy had no one, and because she remembered being 20 and having no one, and because it was simply the thing that ought to be done. Nathaniel was in the doorway of the still-room when she pressed the coin into the boy's hand. She never saw him. He stood in the shadow and watched a seamstress spend her own small savings to save a kitchen boy from the road and ask for nothing, and swear the boy to silence, so that no one would know she had done it. When she had gone, he stood there a long while. Then he went and found the under-butler, and had the broken dish charged to the house, and had Alice's coin returned to her by an intermediary who claimed to know nothing of where it came from, and she puzzled over the return money for a week and never guessed. She had counted that money too many times to mistake its going. 9 shillings and 4pence, saved coin by coin across 3 years, kept knotted in a stocking beneath the loose board under her bed, the whole of what stood between her and the road if Elmswood ever tired of her. She had given it to Tom without letting herself feel the size of the gift, because to feel it would have been to grudge it, and she would not grudge a child his last chance. And then it had come back to her, wrapped in plain paper, left on her workbox, with no name. And for a week she turned the puzzle in her mind at night. Perhaps the under-butler had relented. Perhaps some kindness. She did not know the shape of moved through the house, below the notice of the ones it moved for. She did not think of the Earl. It never once occurred to her that a man who could not say a soft word aloud might spend one in the dark where no one would make him own it. That was the day, though she did not know it, that the Earl of Renwick stopped mourning a brother long enough to see a living woman. He did not tell her. He would not have known how. What he did instead was issue commands, in the manner of a man who has forgotten every softer language. He found reasons to have her in rooms where he was. When the weather turned cold and she was sent to mend the tapestries in the unheated north wing, he came upon her there with her fingers gone stiff and blue, and he said, "Come to the library. There is a fire. You will work there or not at all." When she demurred, because a seamstress at work in the Earl's own library was a thing the house would talk about, he said only, "I did not ask whether it was proper. I said, come inside." And she came inside and worked by his fire, and told herself it was the warmth she was grateful for, and not the low certainty of his voice, which reached some cold place in her that 3 years of service had frozen over. The library was the warmest room she had ever worked in. A fire the height of a child in the great hearth, the spines of 1,000 books catching the light, a rug beneath her stool so thick her needles did not ring when she dropped them. She sat in the corner nearest the window where the light was best, and she mended his linen, his cravats gone soft at the fold, a shirt cuff worn thin. And she found in the intimacy of the task a thing she had no name for, and did not want one. To hold the collar a man had worn against his own throat and set it right with her own hands was a closeness the drawing rooms above would never have permitted, and it passed between them in silence, hour on hour, the fire settling, the clock her father might have envied ticking on the mantel. Once he asked her, without looking up from his book where she had learned her trade. Her father, she said, had taught her to see a thing's true edge before she cut it, that a careless cut could not be taken back. That measured twice was a rule for more than cloth. He was quiet a long moment. "A wise man," he said. "Has a man." She said that he had been, and neither of them spoke again that afternoon, and it was one of the finest afternoons of her life. And she was afraid of how much she wished it would not end. He watched her sew. He pretended to read, and he watched her hands, the sureness of them, the way she bit the thread and squinted at the light, and pushed a loose strand of hair from her face with the back of a wrist too tired to spare a finger. He had never in his life watched anyone do honest work up close, and he found he could not look away from it, the plainness of it, the truth of it. When the library door opened and Lady Ormsby swept in to find the Earl and the seamstress alone by the fire, the silence that fell was a live thing. "Renwick," the dowager said in a voice like a closing gate. "Surely there is work enough for the girl in her own quarters." Alice was already gathering her things, her face burning, but Nathaniel did not rise and did not apologize. "There is a fire here," he said, "and none in the north wing. I will not have my people freeze to spare your sensibilities, aunt." It was the first time Alice had ever heard anyone at Elmswood defend her, and she carried the sentence down to the low room that night and turned it over and over like a coin. Here is the thing the body knows before the mind will hear it. She began to feel where he was in a room without looking. She would be pinning a hem, and know he had entered by the change in the air, the way the light seemed to gather toward the door. Her pulse would rise for no reason her sense could give. When he handed her a length of ribbon, their fingers would touch through her thin glove, and she would feel the warmth of it for an hour after. A small ember she could not put out. She told herself it was foolishness. She told herself he was an earl, and she was a seamstress, and the story had only one ending, and Betsy had named it, and it was not a wedding. She told herself all of it, and her body went on knowing what it knew. He felt it too, though he had less practice naming feeling than she had suppressing it. One evening, late when the house had gone quiet, and she had stayed too long over a torn hem, He came upon her alone in the small sewing room off the library, and he crossed to her, and he reached out and took the ribbon from her hands and set it aside, and his hand came up as though to touch her face, and stopped a breath away, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his palm against her cheek without the touch itself. Neither of them moved. The candle guttered. "Alice," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and he said it as though it were a thing he had wanted to say for a long time, and had only now let himself. "I have not wanted anything in 2 years. I did not think I would." Again, his hand did not close the distance. Hers did not either. The wanting, though, was named, and once named it could not be unsaid. And they stood there on the edge of it, two people who both understood that what came next could not be unmade. Then a footstep sounded in the corridor, and he stepped back, and the moment closed, but it had happened, and they both knew it had happened. It could not stay hidden. Nothing in a great house stays hidden. Lady Ormsby had eyes in every corridor, and it did not take her long to understand that her nephew's coldness had thawed toward the wrong quarter entirely. She did not confront him. She was too clever for that. She confronted the season instead. She threw a ball. She invited the county. She arranged Miss Cordelia Vane at the center of the great drawing room like a jewel in a setting, and she let it be known, in the way such things are let be known, that an announcement was expected before the year was out. And she found a use for the seamstress that would put her back in her place for good. On the night of the ball, Alice was sent up to the drawing room to stand along the wall with the other servants, ready to mend any flounce that tore in the dancing. It was ordinary work. Lady Ormsby, however, had arranged it so that Miss Vane's gown, which Alice had altered, carried a hidden pin left loose at the shoulder, and when Miss Vane raised her arm in the dance, the scene gave, and the lace fell, and in front of the whole assembled county, Lady Ormsby turned and said, in a voice pitched to Carrie, "This is the girl's work, the seamstress who fancies herself above her station. See what her carelessness has done." The room turned. Alice stood pinned by 50 pairs of eyes, the ruined lace in Miss Vane's hand held up like evidence, and she understood that the pin had been left loose on purpose, and that she could not say so without sounding exactly like the girl who imagined herself a heroine. "A servant who forgets what she is," Lady Ormsby said to the room, "is a danger to everyone above her." It was the cruelest thing that had ever been said of Alice in her hearing, and it was said to 100 people, and the worst of it was that some of them nodded. She heard the nodding more than she saw it, a low murmur passing through the room like wind through barley, the sound of 100 people agreeing to a thing because it cost them nothing, and confirmed what they already believed, that a servant should not have been noticed, that a girl who had been noticed had reached above herself and been justly pulled down. She felt the old lesson close over her like water, the lesson 3 years had taught her, that the world had a place for her, and the place was small and silent and out of the light. She thought of the tower, of the boot slipping past the stone, of the weight of a man's whole life in her 2 hands, and she thought that no one in this room would ever believe she had held it. That was the cruelty of the small place. It did not only keep you low, it made your truest acts unspeakable, so that even the things you had done could be taken from you by a woman with diamonds and a voice pitched to Carrie. Alice knelt at the shoulder of the Viscount's daughter and threaded her needle by the light of the very candles that had exposed her, and she set the seam, stitch by stitch, and she did not let one of them fall crooked, because the work at least was hers, and no one in the room could say otherwise. She did not weep. She would not give the room that. She gathered the fallen lace in her needle, and she knelt at Miss Vane's shoulder, and she mended the seam with hands that did not shake, though everything in her was shaking, and she did it in silence while the county watched. And when it was done, she rose and stepped back to the wall and stood there with her ruin around her like cold air. And Nathaniel was across the room, held there by rank, and by the 100 eyes and by the aunt at his elbow, and he could do nothing that would not make it worse, and she saw in his face that he knew it, and she thought, that is the whole of it then. That is the ending after all. She went down to the low room when the mending was done, and no one stopped her going. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, and she took out the one thing she had carried through everything, the small silver thimble her father had made for her 12th birthday. Engraved inside the band with a tiny bell, his maker's mark, the last thing of his she owned. She held it in her palm, and she let herself grieve, not for the Earl, she told herself, but for the girl she had been before the world taught her what she was. She had decided by morning that she would ask the housekeeper for her wages and her character, and go. There was nothing at Elmswood for her now, but the memory of a warmth she should never have let herself feel. She did not know that Nathaniel had left the ball not 10 minutes after she had. She did not know that he had gone to the housekeeper that same night and learned the truth of the loose pin from a chambermaid who had seen the dowager's own woman at Miss Vane's gown before the dance. She did not know that he had sent for his solicitor at first light, or that he had spent the small hours of the morning doing the one thing his grief had never let him do, which was to decide plainly and finally what he wanted, and to reach for it. The county had not dispersed. Lady Ormsby had arranged a breakfast the next morning, the ball's long tale, the announcement she expected still hanging in the air unspoken. The great drawing-room was full again, the same faces, the same Miss Vane arranged at the center when the Earl of Renwick came in. He did not go to Miss Vane. He crossed the whole length of the room in the silence his entrance had made, past the dowager, past the Viscount's daughter and her £30,000 to the wall where the servants stood, and he stopped in front of Alice, and he held out his hand, palm up, in front of the entire assembled county. The room did not breathe. Lady Ormsby's fan stopped at her breast. Somewhere, a cup was set down too hard against a saucer. Alice stood with her back to the wall, and her heart going and did not understand, would not let herself understand, until he spoke. "Marry me, Alice. Let them all hear it." 8 words. He said them level and clear, in the arena where his aunt had ruined her the night before, and he did not take them back, and he did not soften them into anything deniable. He stood with his hand out and waited, an earl waiting on a seamstress before the whole county, and the wanting was not hidden now and would never be hidden again. Lady Ormsby found her voice first. "Renwick, you cannot. She is a servant. She is nothing. She is—" Her sentence had nowhere to go because the room had already turned. The way rooms do when they recognize the truth of a thing, and the county was looking now not at a disgraced seamstress, but at a woman an earl had crossed a room to claim. "She caught me when I fell," Nathaniel said, not loudly, letting it carry on its own weight. "She saved a child from the road with her own wages and told no one. She has more worth in her than this room has counted in a season." He looked only at Alice. "I have wanted this since the Tower. I was too much a coward to say it until you had cause to leave. Do not leave. Marry me." Alice looked at the hand held out to her, and at the face above it, the coldness all gone from it now. And she thought of the boot slipping past the stone and her own arms pulling him back from the drop, and she understood that she had caught him twice, once from the Tower and once from the grief that would have taken him more slowly, and that he was now catching her. She put her hand in his. She did not make a speech. She only said, "Yes," and it was enough, and the county heard it, and the thing that had been impossible the night before became, in the space of one word, simply what had happened. His hand closed around hers, warm and certain, and she felt the whole of the room fall away, the diamonds and the murmur and the long habit of being small, until there was only the plain fact of his fingers around her own and the steadiness of a man who had decided and would not unmake it. She had spent 3 years learning not to want. She had folded her hopes as small as her father's thread box, corner to careful corner, and put them away. Now before 100 faces, an earl had opened the box and would not let her close it again, and she found she did not wish to. Her eyes were wet. She let them be. There was no longer any place in the world she needed to make herself invisible to reach. Miss Cordelia, to her lasting credit, was the first to move. She stepped forward and gathered the fallen edge of her own reputation with the same grace she did everything, and she said quietly to Lady Ormsby, "I believe, aunt, that we have overstayed." She had known for a week that the Earl did not want her, and she found she did not much mind being spared a marriage to a man in love with someone else. Lady Ormsby did not answer. She sat down rather suddenly in the nearest chair, and something in her upright frame gave way, not into cruelty but into the recognition of a woman whose certainties had failed her in the one place she had been most sure. She had protected the order she was raised inside. The order had not needed her protection against a thing like this, and she was old enough in the end to know it. If Alice's story has moved you this far, stay for the last of it. Because the tower is not the ending, and neither is the drawing room. They were married in the small church at Netherford, not the great county affair Lady Ormsby would have staged, but a quiet morning with the frost still on the grass and the vicar's breath showing white in the cold. Tom, the kitchen boy, carried the ring on a cushion, scrubbed pink and solemn with the honor of it. Betsy stood among the guests and wept and told everyone within hearing that she had always known, which was not true, and no one corrected her. Lady Ormsby did not come, but she sent a letter, stiff and short, that allowed the marriage to be a good one, and asked, in the last line, to be remembered to the new countess. It was as near an apology as her whole life had taught her how to give, and Alice, reading it, chose to take it as the whole of one. The first snow came to Elmswood in the week before Christmas, and Alice stood at the tall window of the room that had been the cold north wing, and was now warm, a fire in every grate her husband could find an excuse to light. She had ordered the bell tower opened, not barred, the shutter she had first climbed to reach now standing wide to let the winter light down through the old glass. Nathaniel came and stood behind her at the window, his hand at her waist, and they watched the snow fall on the fields that had been gold on the morning she caught him. On the sill between them lay the small silver thimble her father had made, the tiny bell engraved inside its band. She had shown it to Nathaniel their first married evening, and he had turned it in the firelight and read the maker's mark. And he had said that a house should have a bell in it that rang for good things and not only for the dead. And he had had the tower bell, silent since James rung on their wedding morning until the whole valley heard it. It had not been rung in 2 winters. It rang now for them. She had stood beneath it on their wedding morning, the frost still white on the churchyard grass, and heard the great bronze voice roll out over the valley, and thought of 2 brothers and a rail and a stair. She had climbed to open a shutter, and she had understood that a sound could carry grief and gladness in the same note if a house would only let it. The valley had heard it, and not known its meaning, but she had known, and Nathaniel beside her had known, and that had been enough. A bell does not explain itself. It only says that something has happened and asks the hearer to look up. "You have not climbed the tower since," she said, watching the snow. It was not quite a question either. She had caught his habit of it. "I have no need," he said. "What I climbed to find, I found on the floor of it, with thread in her hair." He turned the thimble on the sill so the bell caught the light. "Your father made you something that rings. Mine left me something that only told. I think I like your inheritance the better." She leaned back against him and let herself be held. And outside the snow came down on Elmswood and did not stop. And the tower stood open to the light at last, its bell gone quiet again. But quiet now, the way a thing is quiet after it has said what it came to say. She had climbed a stair one October morning to open a shutter, and she had caught a man before he fell, and he had not been able to look away, and she had not, in the end, had to make herself small for anyone ever again. The thimble on the sill was the last thing her father had given her. It was no longer the only thing she had. She closed her hand over it, and the little bell inside made no sound at all, and that was exactly right. Thank you for staying to the end of Alice's story. If a small silver thimble and an open tower stayed with you, leave a word below with the moment you'll remember, and let the bell ring on a little longer for you too.